Welcome back to Producer's Toolbox. I'm your host, Carole Adrienne, and today, for all of our audience who have been such prolific viewers of our shows about writing, we have a really special treat today because we're going to be talking for the first time on this show about nonfiction writing. And our guest today is one of our country's most esteemed scholars on the life of President Abraham Lincoln and the author of 9 books on Lincoln, Tesla, and Thomas Edison. David J. Kent is an award-winning writer, an award-winning former scientist, and a global traveler. Hi, David. Welcome to Producer's Toolbox. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Carole. Great to be here.
And you have written 9 books. I wrote one, and I don't know how I survived it, so I'm not sure how anybody makes it through 9, because it's a very particular kind of writing. And I want to ask you about what intrigues you about a subject.
Well, my background, as you said, I was a scientist at one time, and I did a lot of technical writing, a lot of books. A lot of book chapters and peer-reviewed papers and risk assessments and all this technical stuff that very few people actually could read. Other scientists that would only care about it and can read it. It was kind of technical. So about 15 years ago, I decided I wanted to follow the other side of my life, which is I've always studied Abraham Lincoln during even the time when I was a scientist. And so I wanted to write about Lincoln, and I wanted to reach out to the general public and write more for the public and not just for other historians or other scientists. So the first book I wrote was on Nikola Tesla, who very few people even knew who he was at the time, but Tesla Motors were just getting started and becoming popular with the cars. And so I wrote about him, and, he was an interesting guy. And I wrote it with a lot of pictures and a lot of graphics so that it would appeal to a wide audience. Did the same thing with Edison a couple of years later, 2 totally different types of scientists, and then switched over into Lincoln. So the first one, Lincoln book, was actually that same sort of graphics heavy type of book. But then I went back and said, I want to write the book that I've been thinking about for years. And that was Lincoln's interest in science and technology. So that became eventually, after writing 3 other books before I wrote that one, I ended up getting that one written and published. And that became Lincoln, the Fire of Genius, and looked at his commitment to science and technology. So it blended my old career and my new career. And then the new one is very different in the sense that it's a ride-along style book looking at just 2 trips that Lincoln made to New England, and 12 years apart, and why they were so important both to him and to the country that most people don't even know about. So that's kind of my writing. I also, I write thousands. I've written thousands of blog posts and newsletter articles and other journal articles, and both in science and in Lincoln studies.
I love the cover of your new book, the New England Journeys, because the picture on the cover with Lincoln looking over what I presume is America, and it makes me hope that he is still watching out for us. I think I was so attracted to your book about the Fire of Genius because in doing my own research about Civil War medicine and reading more about Lincoln and getting intrigued, and I realized he was a serious techno geek, wasn't he? His friends wrote about him, visiting farms and climbing under the machinery, and he had to know how everything worked. Well, as a scientist, I guess that would appeal to you.
Yeah, it did. And it was, it was fascinating because this is a guy who grew up on a subsistence farm in the frontier. He had less than a year total of his formal education over his entire life. So how is it this guy living on the frontier got interested in scientific topics and technology? And that's what I wanted to dig out in that book. It's one of those fascinating areas that you don't hear about in most other books, and all these other books about Abraham Lincoln. You don't see much about the sciencey side of him. Now, he wasn't a scientist, so I don't want to make it people believe he was a scientist. He wasn't, but he was very interested in it, and he helped promote it and use it. So, yeah, it was fascinating to write about that, and I did blend my two careers, two sides of my brain, maybe.
Well, that was nice. There wasn't a big departure from one. You just kind of morphed into the next stage of evolution of it, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, that made Lincoln so it affected me personally because I thought, oh my gosh, if he were alive today, he would have been like into video games. I mean, model building. I mean, he had an incredibly inquisitive mind, didn't he?
He did. A lot of his colleagues said he had a scientific mind or a mechanical mind or a mathematical mind. And he was very logical, studied Euclid geometry, not so much for the geometry, but for the logic aspects of it. And it really helped him in his career because as a lawyer, as a trial lawyer, you really need to be able to think quickly and present a case that's logical and convincing. And that's really kind of a scientific way of thinking. And he had one colleague that said his opponent would give 7 reasons why this person should be found guilty, and Lincoln would say, well, okay, the first 6, I'll just give him those, but the 7th one, if I can disprove that would show that the whole case falls apart. And he would do that to the jury and narrow it down to the one key area that was important. And I think that helped him through his life and into the Civil War. He helped focus us on what to do to win the war and why are we trying to win the war.
All 3 of these men you have studied like deeply. Tesla talked about renewable energy before anybody else was really working on that, right? And Edison created a lot of the things that are still part of our everyday life. Mm-hmm. What do you get emotionally involved? I mean, what really calls you in to these extraordinary people?
Yeah, I think if you're writing a biography, particular nonfiction in general, but a biography in particular, you have to get emotionally close and empathetic with your topic, because you have to really put yourself in their mind. How were they thinking at the time? And transport yourself back into that time, and that really takes some effort to kind of get out of this presentism where you look at it from our perspective. You have to look at it from what did they know and what conditions were they in at the time. And that's how they made their decisions. And that's important to get at when you're writing about a particular person.
That's really important. The perspective of the time in which they lived. I hadn't really thought specifically about that, but you're right. You cannot make comparisons on contemporary life and understanding. You have to work from, in this case, the mid-19th century.
Right.
Wow. Well, do you have a favorite? I guess you do. I guess Lincoln's your favorite. You've written the most about him.
Yeah, I've been kind of a Lincoln geek my whole life, but and so a lot of what I'm writing now is about Lincoln. But I wrote about Tesla and Edison. I still have the sciencey side. I just like people who are interesting, that have interesting personality quirks, and who lived in difficult times and were able to get through it despite their conditions and their upbringings. And the next book I'm writing after this doesn't have anything to do with Lincoln. Well, maybe a little bit, to do with Lincoln, but mostly it's not Lincoln. And I already know what book I want to write after that, and that's definitely not Lincoln. That's definitely in a different area. So I throw myself into those, and I think all writers of nonfiction need to really immerse themselves in the lives of the people that they're writing about and the times that they're writing about. I think that's really, really something that is critical to be successful.
How do you begin your research? Do you start with the subject of research or the time in which that person lived?
Well, I do a lot of, I read a lot, so I read, 75 to 100 books a year, every year, sometimes a lot more. And about 2/3 of those are nonfiction books. So a lot of them about Lincoln, obviously, but a lot of them are about all sorts of things. This year, because of the 250th anniversary, I've been reading a lot that relate to the founding and the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. And, I've read a lot about the time period leading up to the Civil War and the time period after the Civil War. And so I read a lot of other history. And then because I travel a lot, I've been to almost 100 countries around the world. I like to read about the places that I'm going. So I have a book I'm reading right now about Mongolia, because I'll be going to Mongolia in September. So I like to read about all of those different things. And all of those, when you're reading, you start to get an idea, a sense of where the story is going and how they connect, because a lot of those things connect together. That's how the Lincoln and Fire of Genius came, because the science and the history and the politics came together. So I do read a lot, and then I start to think about a topic that I think would be a good book down the road, and I may have 4 or 5 of those in my head at one time. And then when one of them or all of them get to a point where I think it's viable and it's something that the public would be interested in, then I'll sit down and work up a chapter outline, which is a big part of a proposal you need for a nonfiction book. So you write out the chapter titles and then maybe a paragraph or so of what's going to be covered in each of those chapters. And you need that for a proposal anyway, but it helps me get a sense of where the book goes and where the story would run through the book, what it is that is being told, and what the story is that what conclusions you want the public to get out of the book when they read it. So that's how I get started, is a lot of just general research, and then when I get a topic that I find viable, I'll narrow in and start to read, and then you get to reading the letters and the articles and the newspaper articles from that time period, and that's you eventually get it down to a point where you're reading very, very narrow area in order to create the story that you're looking at.
I start, and I am not nearly on the scale that you are. I've only ever written one book, but when I'm working on that or a screenplay, I start with lists. I'll just list everything that has intrigued me, and it's just partial sentences. It's not even real sentences. And what's your actual first of putting words on paper?
Well, I take a lot of notes. A lot of people don't, but I do. When I read a book, I take a lot of notes. I don't like to write in the book. I'm one of these purists who doesn't write in the books. I know people that highlight and do everything. I can't do that. That's difficult to me. But I write, either handwrite or I put Post-it notes and get the notes later or whatever. But I'll collect a lot of notes that I'll type up in Word, and that makes them searchable. And then as I get to the point where I focused in on a particular topic, and when I want to write a particular chapter, I can search my notes in order to find the stories and the little and the quotes and the things that I want to use. Now, I know a lot of other people, there are software now that people can use to help collect all that information. And I have not been able to teach myself how to learn that software. I'm still, I at least type it in Word, but it's not Post-it notes all over the place like it used to be. But that's how I get it organized in my head. And then, when I write a book, each chapter, I'll sit down and write, take a piece of paper and hand write out, each step of the chapter the things I want to cover. And then once I have it so it makes sense, so that it tells a story within each chapter, and then that chapter fits into the bigger story of the book, then I start to actually write the chapter, type it out on the computer, write the chapter, and I'll tweak it along the way and add things and subtract things. So it takes some time to get it organized, but I think for a lot of people, and one of the hard things is how to get it organized in your head. But one of the best things is once you get it to a point where it's organized and you think it flows as you're writing, it just takes off, and it's easy to write after that, I think. Other people maybe struggle all the way through, but I struggled until I reached that flow level, and then it comes out quickly.
I struggle right up to the copy editors. Yeah. But my mom was a writer, and she wrote a lot of nonfiction really in the psychological and self-help vein. But she used to take 3x5 cards and break down her chapters and her thoughts, and she would lay out like dozens of these 3x5 cards. And I thought there must be a very strong visual connection as to how we organize things. Mm-hmm. Once you see those words. And I know I always think of writing as kind of a more ephemeral thing, but I think it's, I haven't researched this, but I think there is something about the visual aspect of those words.
I agree. And I am very visual. I used to do the 3x5 cards a long time ago. Now they have virtual 3x5 cards. They're software that you literally have 3x5 cards that you can move around on software. Again, I never could grasp that. It's easier for me to use paper and typewriter than it is to use that. But one of the other aspects that relates to that is travel. For somebody like Lincoln, and for Tesla and other people as well, I like to go to the places where they were. And not only do you get a sense of what it was like, what they were there, even though most of these places have changed dramatically since then, but they often have libraries, and they have people that know about them and that you can't find online. When I was writing Tesla, I went to Serbia, and I met with the head of the Tesla Museum in Belgrade. And I went and spoke with the Prince and Princess of Serbia in the royal palace to discuss Tesla, because he was a big Tesla nut. So, going to these places, and I've done that for all Lincoln, and that's what led to the new book, the Lincoln in New England. I was visiting all of these places that Lincoln spoke and getting a sense of what these places were like, and you kind of immerse yourself. Even though everything has changed since then, some of the buildings are still there, and you can see the building, and you can kind of imagine that you're there when Lincoln is there. And that really does, I think, help visualize what you're trying to get across. So I'm very big on going to the places that you're writing about.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and it just kind of puts you more in their actual footprints. Do you ever dream about the people you're writing about?
Do I dream? Unfortunately, yes. Yeah. I have to admit, I have woken up at 2:00 in the morning, and I keep a pad of paper in the table next to the bed, And I've woken up 2 o'clock in the morning and I pull out the pad of paper and I will scribble down things and write things. And there have been a couple of, I'll say there was I guess a few years ago when Fire of Genius came out, I knew I had to give a talk, but I wasn't sure what I should say, what the focus should be, because it was something a little bit off from what the book was. But, I wanted to, I wanted to capture this thing properly, and I just couldn't get it. But I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning. I think it was 3 o'clock that morning. I woke up 3 o'clock in the morning and I couldn't get back to sleep. And it was running through my head. And I sat down and I wrote out the whole thing on several pages of this pad of paper. And then I typed it up and that turned into my presentation. It was almost exactly what my presentation ended up being. I wake up and I find something that I've written. I'm like, what is this? I can't even read it. But that time, I was awake enough and it just hit me. So yeah, unfortunately, I do dream. I had an old boss in the science field. He said, if I wake up in the middle of the night and I think about a strategy that would help one of my clients, I'm going to charge him for that time because I was working for him.
What's your favorite part of the process when you're writing a book?
I think, well, the research is a big thing. I love to learn. I mean, that's why I read so much, and that's why I'm reading things that I have nothing to do with my life, but I think they're interesting. So I read them. So I love to learn. I love to do the research, and then while I struggle with capturing the storyline, I love it when it fits. When I suddenly realize this is it. But I have to tell you, as an author, and I mean, you've experienced this, and I've experienced this with several books. Seeing the book finished and seeing it in the stores, it's a thrill. I mean, you have to admit, because you write a book because you're interested in the subject, and you write a book because you want to communicate information to other people. You want to teach something to other people, and you want to read this. This is an interesting topic. I want to read this book, so I guess I have to write it. So there's a lot of that, but every author wants somebody else to read their book, and they don't necessarily. Everybody wants to get rich writing, but nobody gets rich writing. And I mean, 1% of people get rich writing, but most people, if you sell books, that means you're reaching people. And if you happen to catch a book that goes viral and a lot of people buy it, you still don't necessarily make a lot of money, but you know that a lot of people are appreciating what you put into this book, and by extension, the effort you put into this book, because it's a lot of work. As you know, it takes a long time to write a book. And even after you write it, I finished writing Lincoln in New England and sent it to the publisher at the end of May last year. And it comes out March 3rd of this year. So that's a long time, even after you finish writing it, where there's a lot of design, a lot of editing and things like that. But, so you really appreciate it when it looks like somebody is reading your book and liking it. And when people write to you and say, oh, I really loved your book, it's great.
It is. That is the best. And it's almost like when you run into that where somebody says, oh, I read your book and liked it, and they're talking about it. And it's almost like you found a relative you didn't know about, or a friend who's in the same club or something. But yeah, that really is thrilling. I guess it's interesting to know that what you did made a difference to somebody else, or enhanced.
It's great for the author to think that you made a difference.
Now, I know there's a real sticky wicket with nonfiction in terms of fact checking. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, what's your method?
Well, I there's two things that I'll say real quick. One is always be skeptical of the information that you have. When I was in science, you always had to look at how reliable were these data points. And some of them weren't. But in science, you could go out and you could redo a study and a test, and and redo it and get more better information. In history and biography, you can't do that. You have to work with what you have. And so if you have a letter that you know was written, handwritten by this person, then you're pretty confident that that's how they were feeling at the time, or a speech or something that's written in a newspaper at the time, or a diary. But you have a lot of people writing reminiscences from 1911. They're writing a reminiscence and say, oh yeah, Lincoln and I were best buddies in the 1850s, and he said, quote this, and he's quoting them. As I'm pretty sure 80, 90-year-old guy is remembering something from 60 years ago is not getting the quote exactly right. So you have to be skeptical about that. The other part is you need an outside pair of eyes to look at this. There are professional fact checkers that will sit there and they'll check all the dates and all of that. But just having somebody read it and be able to see that you use the same word 15 times in 2 pages. I used to say ironically a lot, and that's a word that you should use once in a book or never. And say, do you realize you used ironically 8 times in that chapter? And you need that. And where you say James Smith once, and then 15 chapters later, which you might be 6 months later, you're writing it, you say John Smith, and you don't realize you changed the guy's name. Those things, you need that somebody else to be able to look at it and catch things that you can't see anymore after you start reading paragraphs at a time when you're reading something you wrote and rewrote 5 times already.
When I was writing about Civil War medicine, very early on, I realized I did not want to be influenced by what anybody else thought or observed after the fact. So I vowed to only use primary source materials, like you said, letters written by the person that you're writing about. But I wouldn't watch movies or television shows about anything to do with the Civil War, because I thought I don't want anything sticking in my brain and I can't back it up.
Right.
So, wow. Well, what is your advice for anyone thinking about writing nonfiction? What would you steer them to or away from?
Well, start with 3 words. Don't be boring. I mean, you have to be interesting. It has to be an interesting topic that people want to read and that they'll enjoy reading and that they'll tell all their friends about. But I would say you can look at this from 3 different perspectives, 3 different ways. One is that look for something that's unique. There are people who write cradle to grave biographies. I like to pick something that's a piece of somebody's life that most people might not know about and try to do something that's unique. Also, there's perspective. I have somebody I know that wrote a book about Lincoln called Loving Lincoln, and it was from the perspective of women on Lincoln, which usually get ignored. And this was a woman historian who had read more about Lincoln than 99% of people on the planet. And she provided her own perspective as well. So that's one way to bring something that's interesting, is perspective. And then the final thing I'll say is there are different styles you could use. There's straight style, but there's also like this ride-along type style like I'm using in my new book, where people, how do you reach the public? Well, you bring the public along with you when you go to these things. And they can see what you're seeing when you discover it. So that's a style ways of doing it. And there are several different styles people can write in. So that's what I would suggest for people. Be interesting and have different perspectives and unique, and use a style that works for you.
Well, thank you so much, David. I can't wait for the new book to come out. You know I am loving the cover. That's always a good sign.
Yes.
And so out there, writers, don't be boring. Do your research. Do your fact checking. And you may have a book with a great cover and a wide audience, too.
That helps.
Thank you so much for joining us on Producers Toolbox. And we hope you have great success. And we'll see everybody next time.